Hi everybody, I'm Tim from troutandfeather.com and thanks for viewing this YouTube fly tying tutorial. The pattern that I'm going to be sharing with you today is a streamer from the Solitude Fly Company known as the Sculpzilla. This is an absolutely nasty streamer that's just known to catch some really large trout, hence the reason why I'm sharing it with you today. I'll be tying the pattern today in an olive color to closely represent some of the sculpin that I find in my local waters, though I really will encourage you to vary that color to match other bait fish and possibly leeches in your local waters. It's an absolutely easy pattern to vary, and I encourage you to try some other color combinations and be sure to share them on this YouTube page. Now, the really interesting part about this fly is that when you first tie it, you think, wow, there are a lot of materials up front and it's very bulky. However, if you think about a sculpin, they are really just almost fat or chubby in the front, and then they taper to this slender back. And that's exactly how this fly looks when wet. In fact, I'm going to show you the fly just wet at the very end of the video so you can see exactly what I'm talking about. The materials that they chose to tie this with just have so much movement in them, and I think they did just an excellent job of mimicking the sculpin. Now, the one area that I'm going to kind of change this pattern drastically is the fact that I'm not going to be making this articulated. Now, there are a lot of streamers out there right now that are being tied as articulated streamers. And what that means is that we basically have a shank. Attached to that shank is some type of monofilament or some type of braid, and that braid gets attached to a trailing hook. Now, that allows for a lot of different things. Most importantly, it can really allow you to extend the fly and impart a lot of action into it. And that's an absolutely critical component of many of these streamers' successes. However, whenever I think about my local waters and the fish that I typically catch on these streamers, I don't feel that there's a need to tie them articulated in these lengths that they're being tied out there right now. A 9-inch streamer in a lot of my local waters is probably going to scare more of the large fish than actually catch them. So I really have to be cognizant of that before going out and tying these. That's one of the main reasons why I wanted to share this pattern with you today. I have a feeling that a lot of tyers will see this pattern and say, oh, that's Sculpzilla, it's a great streamer. However, it's articulated and I don't tie those, thus I guess I can't have this fly in my box. And I'm here to say, yes, you absolutely can have those flies in your boxes, and you just have to think a little bit outside the box whenever you're tying them. Thus, that's what I'm going to be sharing with you today. In fact, I'm going to be tying this with an Allen fly fishing streamer hook, and it's just an average streamer hook. It's not that articulated shank that you typically will think of whenever we're thinking about some of these streamers. Now, with all that said, I definitely agree that big fly, big fish, but I really have to be aware of what is a big fly for my local waters and what are those big flies for yours. So with all that said, I'm going to show you a picture of the finished Sculpzilla first, list all the materials, go through the tying procedures, then as I mentioned at the very end, I'm going to hold up a wet one and just show you how much action it really has and just show you how that taper in the back really just goes down to absolutely nothing, and it really does closely represent that sculpin. Okay, let's get started tying this Sculpzilla. I'm using a Stonfo Cayman vise today. In it I have a hook from Allen Fly Fishing. This is their S403 streamer hook. It typically does come with a barb, though I've already debarbed it. I'm tying this fly today in a size 8, though I will tie it as small as a 10 and as large as a 2. The first material that we're using is going to be a rabbit strip. Here is a beautiful olive one. I'm going to be using natural today. But what I wanted to show you with this is that the hide is way too wide. I would actually cut this one in half with a razor blade. Here is an example of a natural one we're using today. First of all, I want to make sure that the material is going naturally back towards the bend of the hook. Whenever I measure it, I line it up and I basically take the hide and I want about 1/4 inch of it sticking off the bend. Then I'll take my right hand and basically put my finger and my thumb right at the eye of the hook, and I'll cut it right there. I'll use either a razor blade, or if I use a pair of scissors, I want to make sure that I cut them so I'm not cutting away any of this fur, just that hide. So here is a piece that I have prepped already. Just want to make sure the material is going towards the bend of the hook, which it is. So I'm going to line it up. I'm going to put it about 1/4 inch of the hide towards the hook point, and then just push it through. Once I have it started, I'm going to remove my hook. Just bend the hide around onto the shank pull to the front and just forget about it for a second. And I'm just going to do the exact same thing, pull it towards the back and just not worry about it for the next couple minutes. I'm going to grab some thread. This is 6/0 dark olive. And I want to just build a little bit of a base because unlike the original Sculpzilla, I am not going to be using a cone head. I really love cones. I think they are absolutely just incredible material to really get your fly down there on the bottom, to get it weighted properly, to make sure that it's going to stay in the bottom. However, the majority of the locations where I fish, there's an opportunity for many snags, and I really dislike losing flies. Though it is part of our sport, if I can in any way just eliminate that or just reduce my possibility of losing a fly, I'm going to do so. So what I'm going to do instead is just tie on these dumbbell eyes. I really love these ones because they have a nice, red on the inside. I think that's just a great color. The original Sculpzilla actually does get tied with a cone head, but then they use red on that. So I'm just going to lock these in place. You don't have to really go overboard with locking them in place because we're going to be adding a few more materials to them later on. All right, next, looks like I've captured a couple of those fibers in there. I don't have to worry too much. Let's just wrap this back. I'm going to go until I'm approximately above where the barb would be and stop right there. Then I'm going to line this up, and I want to just put this directly underneath the shank of the hook. I'll try to show you what that looks like. Once I get it lined up so it's even on both sides, I'm just going to bring my thread around. Now before I do that, I'm going to wet my fingers a little bit, and I need to move these materials away from that tie-in point because I don't want to trap too many of those fibers. You're going to naturally trap a couple, but let's just really do our best not to trap too many. I want to make sure it's even. I'll show you what I mean. Now I have it even with just one wrap. Once I'm sure it's even, I can just get a couple more wraps in there, and that's it. Now I'm just going to bring my thread around, fold that piece back, and we're going to go to our next material. Our next material is a really neat one that I love to use. This is called Willie's Sparkling Yarn Fly Tying Material. There's his phone number. The color is olive. This is some really neat stuff. It's almost like a crystal chenille, but it doesn't have a ton of flash. You can see it's very sparse, but then the material you're tying it with is just kind of like a light yarn. I really like this. It's easy to use, it's easy to tie in, and it's not like an overwhelming material like so many others out there today. So I'm just going to lock that in place. You can see I left an excess, and that's okay. I want to just bulk up the body a little bit, so I'm just going to wind forward, wrap all that in place. And then the important piece of this is to, when you advance your thread, keep it back a little bit. We don't want to just fully get it against those eyes, or else it's going to be basically trapping too many materials at that front. Just going to bring the yarn forward like a chenille. Every now and then I want to just pull these fibers back just to make sure I'm getting a bunch of them. There's going to be so many materials on this fly that again, we don't want to crowd it with too many. We want just a nice amount of sparkle. You can see this material just gives you just enough sparkle to know it's there. It's exactly what I'm looking for. Okay, at that point, I'm just going to reverse it. I'm going to bring this rabbit strip straight down. You're going to know immediately, or you're going to recognize immediately, it's too long. And again, that was intentional. By leaving it too long, what I've done, I've also left in all these extra fibers. So from this point to there, I've now kept those extra fibers. Some of them are short, some of them are long, but they're going to add to the movement of this pattern. So I really just want to make sure I have all those fibers. Once I'm sure I do, I'm going to lock this in place. Now, by adding those dumbbell eyes, I didn't mention this earlier, but I was basically implying the fact that I don't like getting snags. What we've done by adding those eyes is to ensure that this is going to ride hook point up, which is why I've inverted it in my vise right now. Now just lock this in place because I want this piece on top. It's going to be covering the point of the hook a little bit if you're attempting to hide that from the trout. Once we've locked this in place, we're going to do our best to trim it. Now, prior to this, or if you read any of the fly tying, we'll say recipes for this pattern, they'll all stress that you want to cut this to a point first before tying it in, and that's where I'm going to disagree, because I've just captured so many more fibers in here by leaving that as an additional piece there. Now I can simply pull up, attempt to cut it as close as possible, and I'm not going to have that much bulk there at all. I'm just going to take a second now and just lock some of that stuff down. You can see I picked up a few excess fibers, and there's nothing to just grabbing those and taking them back. Okay, at this next point, I'm going to just reverse again. I'm going to use a little bit of a red rabbit strip. I'm going to tie a little bit of a red throat on the bottom. The original pattern calls for red guinea, and I really love that red guinea. I think it's a wonderful material, though I feel that it gets lost in the actual pattern. By using this, I'm going to try to ensure that we have red, and we're going to put it in that one specific location, that throat, to represent possibly a bleeding sculpin. I'm just going to trim a nice little section away. Make sure all those fibers are trapped. And once they are, I'm going to go back to the top of the fly. Alright, now that we have that red throat tied in place, we're going to next add a marabou fiber. Now what's neat about adding this marabou feather is that it's going to impart a lot of action into this fly. The other neat thing is that this recipe calls for adding this in almost like a wet fly hackle, and that's really cool. What I'm going to do is grab this marabou by the tip, pull the fibers down in the opposite direction, and create a tie-in point. So my tie-in point is going to be right there. Then I'm going to remove all these fibers once I've locked them in place. Alright, next we have our marabou feather in place, and I'm actually going to be folding these fibers back. And what that means is I'm going to find the center stem, and I'm going to basically be squeezing these together, the left and the right side. And what that does is it's going to ensure, as I wrap this around, that all those fibers point towards that bend of the hook. Now if you can't do it right away, you can also wet your fingers a little bit. That's what I'm going to do here, just to really help everything along. There's one. And there is my second. See, I'm just wrapping my thread through, just winding it left and right because I don't want to trap too many of those fibers underneath. Okay, now I'm not going to trim all this stuff away. I'm simply just going to grab it, pull it back, and then lock it with my thread. Okay, we're getting really close now. We're going to add the final material. We have some chickaboo. These are some dyed olive chickaboo, basically just a grizzly marabou. This recipe calls for 3, one on top and one on each side. Now if you tie smaller flies, smaller patterns, you may not need a full feather, or that one feather could support all 3 the whole way around. So kind of keep that in mind depending on the size fly you're tying and the size feather you're using. You basically want this chickaboo to go back and just cover the point of that hook. So I just want it right there. I'm going to lock the center one in first. And that's going to be my guide for the other 2. Grab the one facing me, put it at the same location. Okay. So now we have the head really built up. You can see that chubbiness that I referenced at the beginning of this video is really now starting to take form. At this point, I'm just going to wrap my thread forward, kind of clean this up a little bit. I want to get a couple more figure eights in there. I was saying earlier you don't have to worry too much about your dumbbell eyes and about them moving, and you can see why now. If you've tied everything in correctly with the right proportions, it's basically all going to be pushing up against these eyes, and they really aren't going to have too many places to go. At this point, you can now put in your whip finish. If you're going to be adding a hot spot, I would only put in one whip finish and stop there, and then add your hot spot like the original Sculpzilla. And I'll talk about that in a second. Otherwise, I'm going to add a little bit of Sally Hansen. This is the advanced hard as nails. I'm going to place a little bit of this Jasper style directly onto my thread. And complete one more set. And now we have the finished Sculpzilla. Let me raise this up just a little bit so you can see everything. Just came out to be a really nice fly, that really just bulky front. However, when you see that originally and you think, geez, my proportions must have been off, trust me, they are not. That is exactly how it's supposed to be. We have a lot of stuff going on in this fly. Because it's tied with these dumbbell eyes, it's going to be riding hook point up. Thus I'll remove it from the vise so you can see it a little bit better here. This is the finished Sculpzilla. That's what it's meant to look like. As I mentioned before, there are so many different color combinations. Don't be afraid to try those out, but really just concentrate on the proportions. You want that longer rabbit strip tail. You want the marabou extending nearly to that point, about 2/3 of the way back. You can see some of my, I guess that Willie Sparkle yarn showing through the bottom, and then we have that chickaboo on top just covering my hook point. It's basically fanning out. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, I have a couple of these tied, and I've just left them in a little bowl of water. And I'm curious to see how they're going to look on camera wet. Probably should have tested that first, but it's semi-live TV. So here is a look at the finished one, and this is just completely soaked. You can see by me showing you this, it is really bulky, just that chubbiness going on at the front, and then the back. That back tail is just so slender. And when you see this in water, everything just completely just puffs out from that bottom section. It really almost just chubs up in the front. It really just takes on that wonderful sculpin impression that we're going for with this pattern. Well, with all that said, I really do appreciate you viewing this YouTube fly tying tutorial. If you have any questions or comments regarding this, feel free to leave them directly on this YouTube page at the bottom, or you can email me at tcammisa@gmail.com. I also encourage you to check out my website, which is troutandfeather.com. On that website, I have various categories of all the flies that I tie via YouTube, and I feel that it'd be a much better resource for you to use versus just checking out my YouTube channel. Well, everybody, thank you again for everything. I appreciate it, and I hope you enjoyed the tying of this Sculpzilla streamer.